Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. This is the place where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. Welcome, TV Herstorians. Today is a really fun conversation. I know it's going to be fun because anytime I get to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, I am all there. We can't learn enough about this incredible woman, and there is so much to learn from. And the person we're going to learn from today is Angela Beauchamp, who came to me through a very unusual way. You know how I pitch to everybody, sign up for my e-newsletter and your information won't be sold and I'm only going to give you stuff that otherwise I honestly don't share on social media? Well, I did. And so in a newsletter from December, I talked about really enthusiastically about my visit to the Paley Center, which ultimately became my December Advanced TV Herstory episode. And lo and behold, the newsletter went out and an hour or two later, Angela Beauchamp replies with, hey, when you were at the Paley Center watching Eleanor Roosevelt in the archives, I too did that. And I'm like, this is fascinating. So she sent me the book and here it is. Today, we are going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt on screen. And not just about Eleanor Roosevelt on screen, but how somebody goes about finding all of the details. Because it's not like it's sitting in one place. Eleanor Roosevelt touched so many different organizations and had so many opportunities to bring her wisdom and her humor and her grace to audiences. And Angie, sure enough, has managed to put all the threads together. So let's get going and speak with Angela Beauchamp, who is at the University of New Mexico.
That's right.
Tell us how you came to have this interest in Eleanor Roosevelt and it occurred to you that this book needed to be written.
I say it started when I was 12 years old. Because I saw the Eleanor and Franklin miniseries on TV. And, like many of us as a girl searching for some kind of role model on television. And there were not that many back then, still not so many. But I just really latched on to Eleanor Roosevelt, amazed at what she'd done. And so then, decades later, I decided to go back to school. Actually, I just got my PhD diploma in the mail in December. The book is my dissertation. So I was interested in docudrama, in historical biopics as well. And Eleanor came to mind because I read everything about her, such an amazing person. But I knew no one had written much at all about her. I knew she hosted 3 television series, but even the most detailed work hadn't yet really told us about it. So that's how I ended up in the Paley. Decided to merge my interests, film and television, with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Your PhD is in?
Film and television studies. And I did a PhD by publication at the University of East Anglia, which is in the UK, mostly remotely.
For those listeners who didn't have a chance to listen to my episode from many years ago now, which is FLOTUS on TV, Roosevelt and Ford. And the fun part, of course, was sort of digging in and creating the context around both of these extraordinary first ladies and why they were not as reined in by the political consultants, by the men who were influencing their husbands. Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the OG influencer. My goodness, if social media were around when she was around. But in fact, most people know she took on lots of extra responsibilities because FDR, her husband, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had been crippled by polio. His logistics to get him anywhere were very complicated. And this was at a time when he needed to instill confidence in the world. And so he relied on her. And so as a result, she traveled and she became very press savvy. But in the end, she ended up carrying this incredible golden Rolodex. For those of you who remember what a Rolodex was. So talk about how it is that you sort of had the film part and you had the TV part. Explain a little more about your research process.
Film and television always go together. They're not really separate industries, as we know. And on your amazing podcast, we know that. In part, it's different decades. So when I'm talking about her in the movies, it's mostly 30s and 40s, of course. We don't have a lot of TV. Then I find out she's on TV in 1945, the day after VE Day. So TV starts earlier than we imagine.
And were you able to see that?
No, I wasn't able to see it, but I was able to read about it in the press. So a lot of what I used was industry press. There's something called the Media History Digital Library, which has scanned thousands of publications from things like Screenland and fan magazines to Variety, Daily Variety, and all kinds of publications that no longer exist. So I started, and that was one of the resources that showed me she is weekly in the entertainment press. So that's really what got me excited. That was one of the resources. So she's talking about the production code. I have a whole chapter on this introduction she did to this anti-Nazi movie, Pastor Hall. So those things are going to, of course, happen earlier. And then, her first TV series is 1950. So I used a lot of those industry publications to tell me what others were thinking about her and what she had to say. Newspaper coverage, it's big news when she's on TV.
Yes. Listeners, if you are not fully aware of the extent of Eleanor Roosevelt's multimedia exposure and how much she contributed, it wasn't just like she was the focal point. She generated a lot. And her daily columns of My Day, that was a not to be missed piece that would come in your newspaper. And it was pretty much covered by all the newspapers. What was your experience and how does somebody access Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day?
Well, what's great is that My Day is now online through the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project. So fabulous for me. I could search for keywords, see what she was talking about. She often talked about what she was doing on television. That's really fabulous. I have a book that was published maybe 20 years ago of selections. That's 8,000 columns. She did it almost daily for 3 decades.
That's amazing. I have to say, I've never read one of the columns, although I will say that this is my favorite Eleanor Roosevelt book. It's just so easy and it's digestible and it is timeless. If you're going to start your journey on Eleanor Roosevelt, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, that's a commitment. That's 3 volumes of pillar to post, birth to death. Start with something where you're going to hear Eleanor's voice. Then those My Day columns. How long were they? I mean, she's in the middle of doing all these things and she sits down and she types, gets them to somebody that then gets them to newspapers. How did that, do you have any idea how that all worked?
Yeah, they're pretty short. It's sometimes less than 5 paragraphs. But one thing you have to remember about Eleanor Roosevelt, who did so much, is she didn't have to type herself. She didn't have to clean the house or make her meals. So she always has a secretary who's typing. She's really, speaking them. And then she did corrections. So in the FDR library collections, you can see a lot of the originals with her corrections.
You've now talked about the Paley Center for Media, the Media
History Digital Library.
Then there is the Eleanor Roosevelt Online Archive.
The Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project is what it's called. They've digitized a lot.
And then is there more Eleanor Roosevelt archives anywhere?
Oh, yes. I used about 20 different archives for the book.
Wow.
For example, her 1960 to 62 show, Prospects of Mankind, was on NET, National Educational Television.
And that's the predecessor to PBS, correct?
That's correct.
The 3 TV shows that she had, for the most part, were Mrs. Roosevelt Meets the Public, Today with Mrs. Roosevelt, and then
Prospects of Mankind. Prospects of Mankind is all online through the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. You can watch every episode of that show, which was monthly on NET. So the others are harder. 1950, 1951, I don't think there's anything online. You'd have to go to the Paley, go to the Library of Congress, and there are only a few.
In the FDR Presidential Library and the big place in Hyde Park, New York, do they have a section for Eleanor? And in your humble opinion, does it do her service?
Oh, they have a huge section for Eleanor. It's really amazing. It's mostly written documents, which were donated after her death. So the White House years, it's the United Nations years, and then up to her death. There's not a lot of this kind of video, but those things were archived differently then. It's a wonderful place to visit.
And get lost for many days, I'm sure. In the pre-TV years, she had her daily My Day column, which covered a wide range of topics. And that really also helped bring to light the fact that she was so on top of international politics and foreign affairs. Before TV, there was her film presence and her radio work. And the radio stuff is that archived? I mean, did you have to, obviously it's not part of your book, but did you kind of go back into radio at all?
Well, I did, to see what she had to say about folks in Hollywood or who she interviewed. But the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project also has a lot of those audio files. The FDR Library has a lot of audio files as well. So, and the Papers Project has transcripts of most of those because, again, we're talking decades of radio programs.
At a time when making radio happen, taping audio or being in the presence of a radio station was about the only way you could do it.
Well, I think she had locations. She knew where she was going to go. Also pre-recorded. Her daughter in later years co-hosted. So her daughter might be doing it at the time, and Eleanor's part would be earlier, in New York. But when she was traveling, she knew she'd go to a studio wherever she was.
So those early, particularly the first two series that happened in the early 50s, that was Today with Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt Meets the Public, you bring in a tremendous amount of detail about how they designed the sets and the processes for bringing one of these recordings to fruition. Where did you get all that information? Because it's not like just obvious of watching it and saying, oh, this must have happened.
That's another case of bringing in information from multiple archives. In the FDR library, there are schematics about where guests are walking in and who's sitting next to her, who's sitting where. The first Today with Mrs. Roosevelt, the premiere episode, includes Albert Einstein, his first TV appearance, and Robert Oppenheimer. So there's a lot of press coverage. Even in the movie fan magazines, they're talking about what happened on the premiere of her show with lots of description. And that's also one that's available to view in the Paley archive. I'd say there are other things. I looked at a lot of memoirs, some of them self-published, people who worked on those shows. There are NBC press releases.
It sounds like in her My Day column, she also rather humbly talked about the makeup process and maybe even some of the criticism she was receiving from the producers about what she was wearing or what she should wear. And you included a couple of those notes. I thought that was whimsical because she was, for the most part, she was the only woman in most of these episodes, right?
That's right. And that's one of the amazing things to find out. She's the first woman to do major public affairs broadcast television. And we know so much about Eleanor, we don't know that. So she's quite a pioneer. And yeah, she wasn't used to wearing makeup. She wasn't used to having to dress in a particular way for TV. They had to wear certain colors. So it's quite interesting for her to, talk to the public about those processes.
By the time we were getting to the early 50s, say 1951, how old was she at that point?
Oh, let's see, 60s.
And she passed at the age of
78.
And she was active on TV almost all the way up to her death. And that's pretty extraordinary. The fact that she was able to invite major figures to these sort of roundtables or these panels, and it really was, it was the predecessor to everything we see on Sunday Morning today. Who were some of the big names that she had on board?
Prospects of Mankind is that series that we can see streaming online. The biggest guest is JFK, both as a senator and as president. It was so important to be on her show that the day he announced his candidacy for the president, he appeared on Eleanor's show. That's the big one. Adlai Stevenson, of course, Eleanor pushed to run for president 3 times. Let's see, Ralph Bunche, who's important in the UN.
Those 3 are in and of themselves major names. And yes, she went to the mat for Adlai Stevenson for president. And you explain really capably and in a very understandable way what transpired during those years and why Adlai Stevenson ran and never really made it to the finish line. Let's go back to JFK for a second, though, because President John Kennedy and his father, Joseph Kennedy, she did not have, it was JFK's respect to re-earn because his own father had lost it dramatically. Explain for listeners what that's all about.
It's really fascinating for her. 1940 and 1960 are really close together. In 1940, Joseph Kennedy is our ambassador to the United Kingdom. He's in the United States, and he says that he thinks Britain should surrender to the Germans. He was pretty pro-German, and Eleanor lost all respect for him at that point. She had gone to boarding school in London as a girl. She was very connected to the UK. So then I know that Joseph Kennedy wanted to run for president, but it ended up his son, John F. Kennedy, who ran. And Eleanor was not happy with him because he didn't speak out against McCarthy. That was an important role for her in the 50s. And she had this natural dislike of the Kennedy family. So it took the younger man a lot of work to get her on board.
For anybody who's kind of a vintage Hollywood buff, and if you've read your Lauren Bacall and Adlai Stevenson, they sort of dated and were sort of companions for many years. Lauren Bacall was very supportive of Adlai Stevenson. Well, Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart were two of the leading actors, people from the performing communities who were just up in arms about the House Un-American Activities Committee and that whole McCarthyism and the red channels and what was so promptly done to impact the careers of very talented men and women who were writers and performers and producers in Hollywood, not so much on Broadway, but in Hollywood, was incredible. And it is, it has been proven over time that for the most part, none of them were communists, none of them associated with communists, or they could explain their connection to communism, which sort of, is interwoven in the previous 30 years of American history. And those 30 years of American history, Eleanor Roosevelt was kind of at the nexus of all of that was happening. So she understood that it was a lot of manufactured controversy. And so to know and to understand that she was very much with the Hollywood community, because at the end of it all, it is your free speech. It is one of the essential foundations of the Constitution, and defending that coming out of World War II was essential. I can see her rallying around this point. What was going on between the two early TV series, Today with Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt Meets the Public, that those were in the early 50s, and then Prospects for Mankind came along later? Was that just because she was too busy doing other things?
Well, the big thing is, it was from the Truman years to the Eisenhower years. So she is no longer offered a TV series in the 50s by herself. She's no longer one of our UN representatives. Those seats go to Republicans. So she does a lot of work for the United Nations herself and through the UN Foundation. But she appears on TV a lot just as a guest. And that gives her a lot more freedom. She talks about political candidates. She talks about particular priorities for politics. And that could be, she's on the Jack Paar show. She's on with Bob Hope, with Ed Sullivan.
Frank Sinatra,
Edward R. Murrow, the big shows. She becomes a guest.
As you did all of the research, if an archive was not available online, you physically spent time in the FDR library or wherever. Was there anything you found as an educated woman, as a feminist, as an American, that just rose the hair on the back of your neck?
Well, I think it's sitting all those hours in the Paley Center. No one had talked about. Well, for example, when Khrushchev comes to visit, he goes to visit Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's on TV. But, well, in terms of the back of my neck rising, it's because I think it's Harry Reasoner who talks about her as an old lady, things like that. So the feminist in me was upset. But it's all those hours in the Paley, which also made me see what a broad range of shows she was on and that she had such influence. So I don't know if there's any aha moment other than just the enormity of the hundreds of hours of watching. And the way that people treat her is the way that you can see it over time as she gets, as an older woman, the men on TV treat her differently, even though Khrushchev's going to go visit her, because she's been to Russia to visit him.
What do you mean that over time men treated her differently?
Well, I think she's more respected and she's in her 50s and her 60s. But once she looks older, I think they treat her like, older women are often just disregarded, even though she is the most politically powerful woman in the country for 30 years. As I mentioned, one of the things I watched in the Paley was the conventions. When she speaks at the Democratic National Convention, 1952, her ratings are much higher than Truman.
And the applause lasts for, the roof is coming off of the convention center.
Yeah. So she's this really important woman, but just the way that commentators introduce her, they act like somehow she's not as important just because she has gray hair and looks older.
Listeners, for just a step back, if you get a chance to listen to my Paley Center episode, I go in depth about skipping through though, the Battle of the Sexes, the 1973 Billie Jean King versus Bobby Riggs. And this was on TV. And Howard Cosell was the primary commentator. He called the play-by-play. And then there were two other tennis players doing the color commentary with Howard, and one was Rosie Cosell. In 1973, to have a woman involved in color commentary was positively groundbreaking, and not just a woman who was going to play along, but rather Rosie let it fly. Rosie was unfiltered. Wouldn't it have been cool for Eleanor Roosevelt to do color commentary at the conventions? Because she would have given any woman who had the podium a little bit more generosity and credibility of what she had done, not to mention the fact that Eleanor always did her homework and was always well prepared for things. But that's the importance of who's telling the story, who is providing the commentary. And I can absolutely feel that pain. And then one more step in the whole how she was so influential in politics. Explain a little bit more about Margaret Chase Smith and then the debate that she and Margaret held on TV and how that all worked out.
Really, the first presidential debate is between Margaret Chase Smith, who's a senator, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Margaret Chase Smith is debating on behalf of Dwight Eisenhower and Eleanor on behalf of Adlai Stevenson. There really hadn't been any kind of presidential debate before that point. Margaret Chase Smith devotes an entire chapter of her memoir to this one debate. She says she knew that Eleanor was much more experienced, was just going to wipe the floor with her. She describes how she acted demure until the end. She just kind of made Eleanor really angry, and then Eleanor, talked too much. So it's the first two women on Face the Nation. There hadn't been any female guests before that. So it's a watershed in television history in terms of politics. And it comes before the Nixon-Kennedy debates, of course. Also, probably Eleanor had the first political debate on her own show, which was the New York City mayoral candidates before then.
Is that presidential debate among surrogates, is that available to be seen?
There are clips online if you search for it. Not the whole thing, but you can see them debating. Margaret Chase Smith was saying, well, of course, it's FDR and Truman who chose Eisenhower, so they would choose him for president, wouldn't they? It's interesting.
And the notion that as a U.S. senator, one of the very few women, Margaret Chase Smith already had sort of figured out a few different ways to deal with the strong egos of people who she was trying to work with or get her point across to. And evidently she used that prowess, that experience. Eleanor Roosevelt had always been such a prominent person whenever she walked in the room that she received so much deference that I'm sure she was caught by surprise. It was a great retelling of that and has made me think, maybe I need to read Margaret Chase Smith's memoir or autobiography. And so is Face the Nation available in the archive for the Paley Center?
It's not. It's Meet the Press that has some in the Paley.
All of this conversation about archiving footage, whether it was TV footage or put on video or film or kinescope. And I'm going to ask you to explain kinescope because that always factors into the question of why is I Love Lucy so in better quality than so many other TV series. The fact that these are now finally being recognized that they need to be stored and converted, that conversion is finally getting these out of the vaults and made to come alive again. So kinescope and sort of how that works.
Well, essentially, they're pointing a camera at the monitor. This is before the days of videotape. Obviously, there's a lot of wave. It doesn't reproduce very well. But those are the only things often we have. Or there's also audio. There's more audio than there is that kinescope video early on.
So the kinescope would have been in Washington or New York. And then that film somehow got distributed to Pittsburgh and Chicago and LA.
Right. It's not broadcast nationally. It would have actually moved around the country physically.
The awe that I have, first of all, that she was able to bring such powerful guests to whatever show, whatever panel she was invited to be on or that she oversaw, incredibly sophisticated conversations, and that the logistical cost of moving then that show to where it needed to be, it's just a testament to how well she was respected. She as an influencer, you are so right that it's not entirely understood that she was as prolific as she was. Moving on to the made-for-TV movies and the miniseries, and it's really where some really important storytelling took place. How hard was it to find some of those series?
Well, not as hard as 1950, but there are sources on the internet. People videotaped at home before most of us had videotape, put them online, or they sell DVDs. I used a lot of that. I think women's stories moved to TV.
Yes.
Because it's less expensive, less, out of feature film area. So all that early TV is early 70s, 80s.
And the two principal series, one was Eleanor and Franklin. And then that was popular enough that then Eleanor and Franklin, the White House years, followed up. Are those based on books?
Yes. So Joseph Lash wrote a biography of Eleanor. It's called Eleanor and Franklin. He was a friend of hers. So he had access to a lot of people that had known her. So that's what it's based on.
And the thing about made-for-TV movies and miniseries is that they brought out some incredible talent. It was really those first opportunities for movie stars, for really the people who we'd only seen on film, to finally find a quality vehicle to star in that then came on TV. And when you only have 3 TV stations available every night, you had a really good shot at making a big splash with a quality production. What is Eleanor's television legacy?
Well, for me, I think it's an example of a person who used the media for good. She is educating the public is one of her main concerns. And she recognized that TV was a place to do that, especially to reach young people. She's really working for the rights of women, for those who are politically marginalized, and using TV to do that. So I think that's a pretty important legacy for us right now. She's always been such a good example for me, just in terms of local politics, how to do these things. She's an important figure.
An essential woman to study if you're wanting to broaden your horizon, chronologic horizon, certainly, of feminism. And that was all sort of before Bella Abzug came along and Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. So before all of them, although I'm sure they were paying a lot of attention and she undoubtedly influenced them, there was Eleanor Roosevelt. Go ahead and tell the listeners how people can access your book. What's the best way for them to get a hold of it? And again, it is Eleanor Roosevelt on Screen, the First Lady's Appearances in Film and Television, 1932 to 1962.
Well, it's available at all those major online stores in ebook and then the actual physical book.
And also, it's published through McFarland Press, and I believe you can buy directly through McFarland as well. Think of McFarland as a kind of a small business. It is a boutique publisher that brings smart, usually academic-oriented folks to publish. So you can always go to McFarland. I think a lot of the folks at McFarland and want to keep them in business. Is this your first book, and will it be your last?
It is my first book. So quite a learning experience. But what I hope to do is do a broader book on first ladies and representations of them in film and television, and it'll be mostly television, of course. So that is a huge project, and I don't quite have it under control. But I'll go back to what I initially started off with, those 70s and 80s TV movies, up to the present.
Wow, that is a big project for sure. I look forward to staying in touch with you on all of this because it's it is going to matter. It's always going to matter how our first ladies present themselves on TV and how that changes from the earliest days of Eleanor Roosevelt. Lastly, I'm just going to ask about the books that you would recommend for a young reader or an adult reader to learn more about Eleanor, other than your own, of course.
For adults, you mentioned Blanche Wiesen-Cook's 3-volume Eleanor biography. I think if you're really interested, that's where you have to go. Especially the first 2 volumes are amazing. It really changed the way that I thought about Eleanor from that Joseph Lash book in the 70s. Joseph Lash is all about her as this nurturing mother figure. But through Blanche's work, we find out she's an incredibly powerful political woman.
And again, that goes to the storyteller. I mean, who is doing the commentary amongst all this research? It is a woman and is sharing very different conclusions.
Yeah, thank you for that point. That's a big part of it. In terms of Eleanor's book, you held up You Learn by Living, which is wonderful. She did several volumes of autobiography, but the last one, you have to read between the lines in Eleanor's autobiographies. She doesn't tell you a lot of controversial details, but it's still really interesting. She also has a book called It's Up to the Women, which is not well known. And in terms of young readers, there's this great book, Eleanor Roosevelt is in My Garage.
All right. And who's that by?
This is by Candace Fleming. And it's a story about her accidentally time traveling. And then she learns how to use cell phones, but also participates with the kids to save a park from being demolished. It really is a lot about who she was and what she would do today. So I like that.
Yeah, I really respect the fact that somebody took sort of the values and the principles that Eleanor Roosevelt documented for herself in her own voice and then has updated them and done a little bit of historical fiction or historical science fiction, in a sense, making her a bit of a hero, recognizing what her impact could be even today, which is, that's what we started off talking about. Goodness gracious, if she had TikTok or Instagram, imagine.
And she definitely would be on TikTok because she adapted print, radio, TV. She would have been on social media, no problem.
And it was partly her job. And it was also partly the fact that she recognized she had the privilege of that very important soapbox that she earned her way to with her husband. I really encourage everybody to phone up all the way around. Find whatever you can on Eleanor Roosevelt. The Eleanor Roosevelt on-screen book from Angela Beauchamp is a great way to start because it, if nothing else, leads you to a bunch of online opportunities to see, to just experience. And maybe that's what it's going to take to whet your appetite to go a little further in depth. And in the meantime, we're going to track Angela Beauchamp's progress on bringing in all of the other first ladies and tracking what they did on TV. We're really grateful to have you on Advanced TV Herstory today, Angie.
Well, thanks, Cynthia. I love your podcast, so it's really exciting to be on.
Eleanor Roosevelt, my goodness, the energy, the intelligence, the prolific amount of work that is available for us to enjoy and understand today, whether it's written or audio or from television or film. This is why I podcast. I'm very grateful to Angela Beauchamp for writing a book that helps us find how to access all of this brilliance. Find more information about what Angie and I talked about in the show notes. Lots of links there, as well as a big thank you to Mary Lou Morose for always keeping me on track with details, as well as cleaning up this audio so it's beautiful for your ears, and to Nivea Lopez for doing the same thing in the video format. I am nowhere without these two. And lastly, many thanks to Jazzers, Take Me Higher, which is our little ditty. That's what brings us in together and takes us out. Many thanks for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.